In 1958, America was still divided by an invisible yet brutal line: race. In the state of Virginia, Jim Crow laws remained in effect like a shackle tightening around freedom, where a kiss of the wrong color could mean prison and interracial marriage was considered a criminal offense. In that context, two young souls, Richard Loving, a white man, and Mildred Jeter, a woman of African American and Native American descent, grew up together in Caroline County, Virginia. Their families lived side by side, close as lifelong neighbors, preserving their bond through generations, despite the social prejudices around them. The childhood friendship between Richard and Mildred quietly blossomed into a deep love. They didn't love out of curiosity or to challenge anyone. They loved how two people needed each other in a world full of barriers. They knew the law would not accept them. They knew the judging stares and the malicious whispers from those around them. But love does not ask for permission to exist. And so, Richard and Mildred made a decision, both romantic and reckless, to get married. Because Virginia law forbade it, they quietly drove to Washington, D.C., where interracial marriage was legally recognized, to hold their wedding. No lavish white dress, grand celebration, or relatives from both sides offered blessings. There were just the two of them, a marriage certificate, a quiet smile, and a fierce belief that loving each other could never be a crime. But they had no idea that that love would be treated as one upon returning to Virginia. Just a few weeks after their modest yet significant wedding in Washington, D.C., Richard and Mildred Loving returned to Virginia with warm hearts and the belief that if they loved each other enough, everything would eventually be all right. They moved into a small house on the outskirts of town and began a simple married life. Richard worked in construction, and Mildred tended to their home. On sunny afternoons, they planted flowers in the backyard. They lay beside each other at night, dreaming of a peaceful future. But Virginia did not sleep. On a sweltering July night, while they were both sound asleep, a sharp noise rang. The door was kicked open. Flashlights blazed into their faces. Boots thundered against the wooden floor. And then, the cold voice of Sheriff Garnett Brooks sliced through the darkness like a judgment. "What are you doing in bed with this colored woman?" Richard jolted awake, instinctively pulling Mildred close beneath the thin sheet. Mildred, her voice trembling but filled with quiet courage, replied, "I'm his wife." Brooks frowned, his eyes burning. "Here, you are not allowed to be husband and wife," he snapped, and with that, he ordered both of them arrested as if they had committed a grave crime. Richard was handcuffed, but released hours later after posting a $1,000 bond. Mildred, however, was not as fortunate. She was thrown into jail, alone, for 3 cold, grueling nights, locked inside a cell where the walls didn't need words to remind her that a black woman loving a white man was something society would never forgive. 3 nights, with no Richard by her side, no family, not even a kind word. 3 nights, to understand that they weren't just up against the law, but an entire system built on hatred and racial segregation. But even in the depths of that humiliation, Mildred did not break. Instead, her resolve hardened. If this life refused to accept their love, they would fight for it, to the very end. The trial was swift, but the sentence landed like a blade, slicing through their future. Standing before Richard and Mildred, the judge was more than a representative of the law. He embodied an entrenched ideology, deeply woven into the fabric of Southern American society: segregation, prejudice, and oppression. "You have 2 choices," he declared, without even bothering to look Mildred in the eye. 1. Go to jail. 2. Leave the state of Virginia for the next 25 years. You may not return together. 25 years. A quarter of a century, in exchange for the only thing they had done: love each other. At that moment, they could do nothing but hold each other's hands tightly. Mildred squeezed Richard's calloused hand as if to say, "Don't let go. No matter what, don't let go." They chose to leave, not out of fear, but because their love deserved a chance to live, no matter where. On the day they left Virginia, there were no farewells, no tears. Just an old car carrying two people, a love story, and the ache of being cast out from their homeland. Washington, D.C., where they once exchanged vows full of hope, now became their temporary sanctuary. They started over from scratch, renting a home, finding jobs, and trying to live as everyday life as possible. But their hearts remained in Virginia. Every time they drove across state lines to visit their parents, they had to travel separately. They couldn't appear together. They couldn't hold hands. They couldn't let anyone see them as a family. They lived like fugitives, though they had committed no crime, but loved the wrong color. Many nights, Mildred lay awake, remembering the house where she grew up, the old field, the apple tree in the yard, and the distant barking of dogs. All shadows, now in her memory. All stolen, just because she loved a white man. But through all the pain, Richard held her each night, whispering into her ear, "I'm sorry I brought you into this life, but I've never regretted loving you." And for Mildred, those words were enough to keep going, no matter how exhausted she was. Washington, D.C., a city bustling with crowds, constant car horns, and buildings swept by cold winds, never felt like home to Richard and Mildred. They didn't flee because they had committed a crime. They were forced to leave, simply because their love crossed the color line. Their small apartment on the city's outskirts was cramped and worn down, with peeling walls and a leaky roof when it rained. But it was a place where they could hold hands freely and call each other husband and wife without fearing the police would break in during the night. They began building a home with only two hands and a love that never ran dry. Richard worked at construction sites, coming home daily with dust-covered clothes and cracked, calloused hands. Mildred sewed in a small garment shop, where the needle pricked her fingers more often than the cloth. Neither of them complained. Neither spoke of hardship. They had already lived through worse, being forbidden to love, being exiled from the place where they were born. Life was modest, but genuine. Each evening they sat at an old wooden table, fed their firstborn, and dreamed of a day when they could return home without walking separately. Yet, longing crept into every breath. Mildred often stood by the window, gazing at unfamiliar streets, her heart aching for Caroline County, the scent of fresh grass, and her mother's soft voice. Richard didn't say much but take out his old harmonica and play a few blues bars every night. Wordless melodies, like his soul telling the pain of being torn from the land that had belonged to his people for generations. They still returned to Virginia now and then, but separately, never together, by the law. Visits to their parents were secretive, like criminals sneaking through the night. Quick embraces, silent tears held back. We did nothing wrong, but must live like we're guilty. That injustice didn't kill their love, but it deeply affected their dignity, hope, and longing to simply live by what was right. And then, one day, Mildred sat at their old wooden table and wrote a letter that would change everything. A letter was written not just for them, but for the millions of couples who would come after them. One spring night in 1964, with both children sound asleep, Mildred sat quietly at the kitchen table, the yellow light casting shadows across her worried face. In front of her lay a blank sheet of paper and a fountain pen, trembling in her hand. Years of living in exile had tightened her heart, not because of poverty, but because of the profound injustice of not being able to live openly with the man she loved in the land where she was born. She thought of their wedding photo they had to hide, of that visit to Virginia done in secrecy, to place flowers on her mother's grave, then quickly leaving before anyone could see. We haven't done anything wrong. We love each other. And so, with all the courage she could gather, Mildred wrote a letter. Addressed to the U.S. Attorney General, Mr. Robert F. Kennedy. In it, she told their story, about the 25-year exile sentence, about being unable to live together in their home state, despite being legally married in Washington, D.C. She didn't use angry words, just a message so sincere it caught in the throat. I hope you can help us, so that we may live together as a family in the place where we were born. Not long after, there was a response. Kennedy, an active supporter of the civil rights movement, did not ignore her. He forwarded Mildred's letter to the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU. The organization, known for defending citizens' rights against injustice, immediately recognized this as a special case, both profoundly moving and legally profound. Two young attorneys, Philip Hirschkopf and Bernard Cohen, were assigned to the case. They didn't see loud activists or political symbols when they first met the Lovings. They saw a humble couple, worn down by years of separation from their home. But that quiet dignity only made the lawyers more determined. No one should have to live like this, just because they loved someone of a different color. The legal battle began, quietly, but with immense weight, and the humble couple had no idea that the letter they wrote from a cramped kitchen table that night would become the first spark in a historic ruling that would change the entire United States. The two young ACLU attorneys, Philip Hirschkopf and Bernard Cohen, didn't take long to realize that the case of Richard and Mildred Loving was not merely a civil matter. It was a symbolic struggle, a chance to challenge one of the last fortresses of institutional racism, the law banning interracial marriage. At the Virginia State Appellate Court in 1965, the state's representatives clung to worn-out arguments. God created the white, black, yellow, and red races, and placed them on separate continents. Judge Leon Bazile, the same man who had sentenced the Lovings, reaffirmed that the separation of races was the will of God. To him, interracial marriage was an unauthorized interference with the divine order. It wasn't just prejudice, it was prejudice dressed in divinity, shamelessly protected by the law of that era. Richard and Mildred were not present at the hearing, but when they heard those arguments, they were speechless. It seemed that everything they had endured, jail time, exile, burned letters, still wasn't enough to make people understand. Love has no color. Despite losing in the state court, they did not give up. With the ACLU's support, they appealed to the United States Supreme Court, where justice was no longer the fragmented voice of individual states, but the defining voice of national law. They didn't chant slogans, didn't stand on stage, or speak to crowds. They said, "We love each other. We have the right to live together. That's all." And that made the whole country listen. The Supreme Court agreed to hear the case. A new light flickered through the darkness of injustice. This was no longer just the Lovings' fight. It was the fight of millions of Americans living illegally, simply because their skin tones did not match. While awaiting the Supreme Court's hearing, Richard and Mildred made a bold and risky decision: to return to Virginia, the place that had once condemned their love as a crime. Though their sentence of exile was still in effect, they no longer wanted to live like outcasts from the land where they were born. Virginia was home, and though the law had yet to recognize it, they chose to go back, to live, to raise their children, and to wait for justice in silence. The ACLU pledged to post bail immediately if local authorities intervened. That promise reassured them, but it couldn't fully erase their fear. When an unfamiliar car stopped in front of their house, Mildred would startle. Richard's eyes would cautiously narrow when a white stranger asked for directions. They lived as if walking a tightrope, balanced between hope and the looming threat of arrest at any moment. Meanwhile, the world outside was changing by the day. The civil rights movement was spreading across America. Black Americans were rising, demanding the right to education, ride the bus, vote, and love. Protests broke out from Alabama to Chicago. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke for millions. And in the shadows of those massive struggles, Richard and Mildred Loving quietly waited, holding on to their own quiet but significant fight. No banners, no chants, no cameras, just a small house, a married couple, 3 children, and an unshakable belief. One day, love will no longer be considered a crime. In 1967, the case Loving v. Virginia was officially brought before the United States Supreme Court. This was no longer just the fight of a married couple. It had become a battle between love and a system of racial segregation that had lasted for centuries. Inside the courtroom, the state of Virginia clung to its old arguments. Laws banning interracial marriage were, they claimed, necessary to protect society from psychological and moral decline. One deputy attorney general even compared interracial marriage to incest, a cruel accusation not just against Richard and Mildred, but against millions of people of color across the country. 2 young ACLU lawyers, Philip Hirschkopf and Bernard Cohen, represented the Loving family. They didn't shout slogans. They didn't lash out in anger. Instead, they delivered a message so simple it stunned the court. Your Honors, Richard Loving asked me to share just one thing with you. Tell them I love my wife. And it is unfair that I can't live with her in my home state. The room fell silent. There are no scholarly arguments. There are no references to slavery or systemic white supremacy. Just the honest words of a husband, a man labeled a criminal simply because he loved. Attorney Hirschkopf followed with a powerful truth, exposing these laws for what they truly were, the lingering remnants of slavery. If a white person and a black person can be arrested simply for marrying, then we live in a nation where love is treated like a threat. The hearing lasted for hours. Richard and Mildred Loving, 2 people who never sought the spotlight, who never asked to be symbols, became the face of a movement for equality and justice in America. And through all the arguments, testimonies, and legal citations, they said very little. They just sat there, holding hands. But that was more than enough. On June 12, 1967, the United States Supreme Court officially announced its ruling in the case of Loving versus Virginia. With a unanimous decision, the court declared, marriage is one of the most basic civil rights of man. To deny that right based on race is unconstitutional, a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. All anti-miscegenation laws still in effect in 16 U.S. states were immediately invalidated. Richard and Mildred Loving, 2 humble people, neither politicians nor activists, had led a legal revolution with nothing but their love and unwavering resolve. Chief Justice Earl Warren, reading the opinion, emphasized, there is no legitimate purpose that justifies the state's interference with the freedom to marry solely because of racial classifications. To maintain such laws is to uphold a form of racial discrimination that is incompatible with a democratic society. From Washington, D.C., to the farthest corners of the American South, the news spread like wildfire. Those who had once loved in silence, who had hidden their relationships out of fear, were now legally recognized. Mildred didn't cry. She whispered, now I feel free. All we ever wanted was to live at home, together. To Richard and Mildred, they never saw themselves as heroes. They didn't fight for glory or a cause. They fought for something far simpler, to be together, like any other married couple. After their resounding victory at the Supreme Court, Richard and Mildred Loving returned to Virginia, the place that once exiled them for daring to love, now transformed into a land where they could hold their heads high and build a home. No fanfare, no spotlight, no pursuit of fame. They chose a simple life, just as they had always been. Two people who never needed applause, only the right to be seen and loved as they were. They built their own small house in the quiet countryside, where their children could run across the fields, where warm dinners were lit, not by legality, but by the blood, tears, and courage it had taken to earn their place at that table. Their 3 children grew up in a home where love was sacred and truth was defended. They didn't need to understand the legal system, only that their parents had fought to protect something sacred: love. Each morning, Richard would wheel his motorcycle into the yard, constantly glancing at Mildred with the same gentle eyes as the day they first met. And Mildred, quiet and steadfast, cared for the family with a soft voice and an unshakable gaze. They weren't heroes in capes, but they changed history. In 1975, tragedy struck unexpectedly. A drunk driver collided with the Lovings' car, taking Richard's life at the age of just 41. Mildred survived, but lost the partner who had stood beside her through the darkest and most defining moments of their lives. She chose to remain in the home they had built together, raising their children with the memories of a man she had loved. They rewrote a nation's story, from the days of hiding to the moment. Richard Loving died young, but his name, alongside Mildred's, is etched into the fabric of American history as a symbol of courage and unwavering devotion. After the tragic death of Richard Loving, Mildred continued living in their small home in Virginia, a place woven with memories of love, pain, and the triumphs of their shared journey. She did not step into the spotlight. She never used her fame to enter politics or become a public symbol. Mildred lived quietly, but her example never stopped speaking. In 2007, on the 40th anniversary of the historic Loving v. Virginia ruling, Mildred broke her long public silence with a statement that was both emotional and groundbreaking. "I believe that all Americans, no matter their race, sex, or sexual orientation, should have the same freedom to marry." With those words, Mildred wasn't just speaking for herself. She extended the historical embrace of the Loving case to include LGBTQ+ individuals longing for the same right, to love and to marry. At a time when same-sex marriage remained a hotly contested issue, her voice became a powerful moral beacon, genuine, courageous, and profoundly moving. In 2008, Mildred Loving passed away from pneumonia, ending a life that was quiet but monumental. She died in the home they built together, surrounded by the laughter of grandchildren and the respect of a transformed America. An America changed in no small part because of the unwavering fight she and her late husband had led. Since the 1967 Supreme Court decision, the United States has come a long way in marriage freedom. Today, 1 in 6 newlyweds in the U.S. are in interracial marriages, a 5-fold increase from the time of the Lovings' victory. No one can deny it. Richard and Mildred Loving opened the door for millions of hearts to choose the ones they love freely. They never needed to stand on podiums, but their name, Loving, has become an immortal symbol of love without race, barriers, and fear. If it's real love, color doesn't matter. Mildred Loving.